Hey guys, so I'm making this video today. Sorry I look kind of ugly because every time I go to work I have to just look really bland and plain, but whatevers. So my hair looks like, I don't really usually wear it like this, but anyways. So I'm making this video today that kind of was prompted by this conversation that I got into with a stranger on the internet. What platform? Of course, Facebook. So I got kind of dragged into that, sadly, but it's a topic that I have heard about before and kind of got into it with people before, that has to do with the pet trade and conservation. So usually on these topics people kind of choose one or the other, either like the pet trade is the devil, it's awful, completely should just stop, whatever, and that conservation programs should really just be monitored by the professionals and facilities like the AZA. So the AZA is the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. They certify facilities. Basically, they are federally permitted and federally recognized and things like that. So they're kind of like the government in the sense of like the animal world versus private ownership, which includes the pet trade. Very few private sectors is what we call it. The private sector are AZA certified. The AZA really doesn't like working with private organizations because just like everything, tale as old as time, the bad ones ruin it for everybody. So before we get into that, there are very bad private facilities as well as really bad individuals that don't know how to take care of animals. So that is a huge part of it that ruins it for a lot of the good ones. So keep that in mind. But this topic, the person got really hostile and rude just off the bat, which I think is so unnecessary, especially with a stranger on the internet. I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm not claiming to know everything about this because I definitely don't. I haven't been in this career as long as some of these other people. So if I am wrong, there is a way to like respectfully express that, in my opinion. But this prompted me to finally make this video because it's not the first time I've heard these types of statements directed at me and kind of being said as like black or white. It's this or nothing. You're wrong, I'm right. Like that type of energy when it comes to my opinion, which is all it is about this topic. So I'm going to make this video in regards to these comments that were made to me on this topic because it's not the first time I've heard like similar things. So that's why I decided to make a video about it. So we know what's going on in Australia is incredibly tragic, incredibly sad. Now, Australia is a massive island, super massive, like larger than most. So we have to keep this in mind that there is a slight exception to like the statements I'm saying, but I think in my opinion, they still had value, and it's really just my opinion that I was getting at. So I'm making this video because it's not the first time I've heard these types of statements. So I do not personally breed critically endangered animals, but I am a part of 3J's Tortoise Sanctuary, which they are. Now these animals, this group is working with AZA certified facilities for conservation programs. So that means that these animals are logged in books based off of their genetics. We've also been involved in multiple genetic research studies from universities. And we also put them into the pet trade. So this video is how does the pet trade and conservation overlap? How do they come together? Because it is not one or the other. A lot of these times, these things overlap, and that's kind of where my statements were focused in, and it's something that I truly am passionate about because I feel like, why do people have to take one side or the other? Why does one side have to be completely wrong and horrible and evil, and the other side's right and professional and the only way? It's really just not realistic because regardless of the laws, regardless of the species, there's always going to be criminals. There's always going to be people who are taking them from the wild or in the black market pet trade and things like that. So where does this all come into what I'm trying to say? So my statements were along the lines of, well, this is a good time to focus on Australia's strict export laws when it comes to rare and endangered animals. They don't allow any of their animals to be exported from the country. So I'm sure there are exceptions through like AZA zoos and conservation programs, but I can't even imagine how much paperwork goes along with that. So it's impossible for anybody in the private sector to get their hands on these rare species. Now, whether that's for a pet or for a personal private conservation program, whatever, who knows. So my comments were along the lines of it's a good time to focus on this because animals that are specifically from islands, specifically endemic to islands, are more at risk of extinction. Almost 1 billion animals have been killed in these Australian bushfires, and that could have potentially wiped out the entire population of that animal. Now, if that animal is not in any other program around the world, that animal's gone forever. Extinction is forever. So my opinions on it are that maybe the laws should be a little more lenient or easier for individual or private sector ownerships to get their hands on them, because assurance colonies, which I wrote an article about with Reptiles magazine, are really important for species conservation. Assurance colonies are groups of these animals that are able to breed in captivity, so that could be anywhere in the world. They're able to breed, and we at least have them in captivity if something catastrophic happens in their wild ranges, their wild habitats. So specifically islands that are usually very smaller, extinction is more of a risk. So for example, in the last 400 years, birds that have gone extinct, most of the time they're from islands. They're not from continental areas. So I do have a few articles that I looked up here. So island extinctions, this is from 1992 actually. The case of the endangered nightingale reed warbler. So first line in the intro, it says, during the past 400 years, bird extinctions rarely have occurred in continental areas. Of the 217 species that have disappeared, all but 17 are insular forms. In the Hawaiian Islands alone, more bird species are threatened or endangered than in the entire continental United States. So this is just saying that specifically birds for this paper, this scientific paper, they're more at risk for extinction because they're from an island. So think about if a catastrophe happened in an island like Hawaii, whatever, a tsunami, earthquake, fires, invasive species, disease, whether this is caused by natural events or because of humans, extinction is forever. So it doesn't really matter at that point. And if you don't have that species somewhere else, they're gone forever. So this person brought up that the pet trade is useless. The pet trade just feeds evil people their cravings for exotic animals in captivity, where most of them just die. Most of them don't care about genetic diversity. Basically, pet trade's evil, pet trade's useless, whatever. But the pet trade is always gonna be here. It is a industry, but it's different because it's living things. So it's more complicated, and the people in the industry are quite different, which is just something I've come to know as my own experience. So repatriation, that is a term for when animals in captivity, they are quarantined, they are bred, whatever it may be, and then they're released back into the wild. So this guy was saying in Australia, like, that'll never happen, like, it's such a risk to be bringing Australian species anywhere else because of invasive pathogens, things they're not, couldn't fight off, whatever. And that's totally true. But I think invasive pathogens specifically are inevitable, because if you look at Australia, think about feral cats and how they are bringing pathogens that are invasive to the island there. They've killed a lot of the marsupials, the macropods, things like that. So invasive pathogens, they're probably going to happen regardless because of the way that society works. Just, it's gonna happen. And repatriation has been prohibited in a lot of areas, and it's understandable to a point, why take the risk? But if you look at examples like the Galapagos Islands and Madagascar specifically, incredible conservation facilities have actually been successful in repatriation. So specifically like the plowshare tortoise and even radiated tortoises, which are some of the most critically endangered reptiles on the planet, they've actually successfully re-released them into the wild after quarantining them or captive breeding them, which supports their conservation. So people that usually take the stance of like prohibiting the pet trade are super unrealistic, because you're always going to have criminals that take them from the wild. So the pet trade takes pressures off wild collection. When you breed them in captivity, now they're available from a sustainable source. They also are possible for repatriation, which we do have some examples of. Let me see if I have the papers here. Let me find it. So repatriation of Galapagos tortoises was established in 1965. This was a successful situation. The article here is based out of Ecuador. So this is rearing and repatriation of the Galapagos tortoises, a case study that you can search that up. And this article here is all about trial release of the world's rarest tortoise, which is the plowshare tortoise in Madagascar. So this was a trial release of 5 juvenile plowshare tortoises, was conducted in an area of natural habitat from which the Malagasy tortoise had apparently disappeared some 20 years ago. The trial release was a success. All 5 tortoises survived the first year in the wild. No homing phenomena was observed. And they established their home ranges near the release point with no tendency to move in a particular direction. In the end, it says, since the 5 captive bred tortoises survived from 1 year, did not disperse, and appeared to have normal behavior, release can probably be considered a viable conservation strategy for this critically endangered species. So basically my statements on this are that conservation and the pet trade do overlap. The pet trade is an industry. Although there are horrors within this industry, it is an industry that has been happening and will continue to happen. I don't like the idea of prohibiting individual people or individual private facilities from having animals. Like, basically that means that there's no way they can get the permits to own these animals legally, which fuels the illegal trade, because they're always going to be criminals, but maybe those criminals are actually breeding them in captivity. That's the best case scenario you can hope for, and they're not just selling them for parts and bushmeat. But the pet trade does matter. We put Galapagos tortoises into the pet trade in the United States, and I think that every single animal that's critically endangered, that's put onto the planet, is a part of its species' overall conservation. So here's an example, the radiated tortoise. Okay, so this was legally obtained within my state from a captive specimen that died naturally. So I did not buy this, I am not selling it, it was not illegal. So yeah, that's something you always have to keep in mind when you have specimens. Like, you need to make sure you have the source of where it came from legally and so on. So the radiated tortoises have been repatriated in Madagascar, and apparently so has the plowshare tortoise. This paper was from the year 2000. So repatriation is possible in islands. Yes, Australia is extremely large compared to these other islands, which it might be more relevant to smaller islands in the cases of natural disasters and predators that are invasive and invasive pathogens and things like that. But conservation and the pet trade do overlap. I have also been a part of studies where a pet trade facility that is breeding a variety of animals of interest for scientists, they come and use those animals for their studies. So this does overlap. These industries overlap, and some people just really hate the idea of that for some reason. But I think it's something to acknowledge, because every single animal that's especially critically endangered, regardless if it's a pet or it's a part of a prestigious AZA program, it's contributing to its species conservation just by existing. And it really upsets me when people say that, well, that Galapagos tortoise that you sold as a pet is useless to conservation. I don't agree. I don't agree at all. And I wish that there was more responsible people, because it really is the irresponsible ones that have made this impossible for private ownerships. But I feel like as individuals, as private facilities, we should have the option, we should have the right to own these animals for whatever it may be. Because regardless if you're breeding them to be pets, regardless if you're breeding them specifically for conservation intentions and genetic diversity, they do contribute to their species' overall conservation when they're a critically endangered animal or rare animal. And now think about if Australia, those fires killed every single one of those animals and there's no more of them. I'm not saying that's what happened, that's what's happening, or that's what's realistic for Australia, but my comments in regards to this topic were directed and kind of focused with that mentality of private sector ownership. I'm talking about responsible ownerships here, should be allowed with island species specifically, because island species are more at risk for extinction. And if we can help prevent that, that's amazing. And for animals like the plowshare tortoise, the Madagascar radiated tortoise, the Galapagos tortoises, no matter what, who you are, individual, private facility, AZA, every single animal you're putting onto the planet, 3Js, thank you, Jason, thank you, is contributing to its overall species' conservation. So that is why I would like to make this video to kind of just emphasize my opinion, which is all it is. Little old me, nobody, you know, it's just my opinion of why I think that private sector ownership should be allowed in these prohibited areas like Australia, because overall there will be bad people, and no matter what, but for the good ones, maybe they could really benefit these critically endangered animals. And that's what I was trying to get at. I'm not an expert, I'm not always right, I could be wrong about these topics, which I would love to learn more about, so I can formulate more proper opinions in a way that helps me as an individual, as a conservationist, as someone who's a part of the pet trade, and so on. So that's why I was prompted to make this video. I hope it made some type of sense. I hope that, you know, you don't hate me for these opinions, but the pet trade does matter to conservation to a point. There are a lot of things wrong with it. There's a lot of things wrong with the private sector. There's many horrible private facilities out there, which again, they make us all look bad. But I don't think it's right to completely prohibit private ownership of certain species. So that's the direction it's going. Soon enough, we're not going to be able to really have anything because people keep going out of their way to get these permits, to get these animals, and then they do a horrible job, and that reflects on all of us in the private sector. So it's unfortunate, but it's realistic. And I just wanted to take the time out to say this, because it's not the first conversation I've got into that the other people are very hostile and rude about. So I hope you enjoyed. This is part of my bone collection. If you'd like to see all of my bones that I have collected, my osteology, let me know and I can maybe make a video about that. But this is the radiated tortoise, incredibly beautiful animal, incredibly beautiful, from Madagascar, critically endangered, really on the brink of extinction to a point in its wild ranges. And I hope that conservation, pet trade, whatever it is, can help this species and others like it successfully make a comeback, whether that's repatriation, whether that's captive breeding, whether that's assurance colonies. That's always my intention with topics like this and my opinions on things like this. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.